All right, so the lecture I'm going to give today is about the Yoga Sutra, right? As Thomas pointed out, actually, the word yoga gets used in a lot of different ways. It's kind of a pan-Indic sort of generic way of talking about spiritual praxis, you know. And it gets used by, we have Yogacara Buddhism, and it gets used by the Jains. And when somebody uses the word yoga, it can be used in a variety of ways. And it gets even worse in modern times, or at least more complicated in modern times, because now we have this whole movement of transnational postural-based yoga, as Mark Singleton would call it, whereby we have this new form of yoga that mostly focuses on the body, you know, with some slight spiritual, you know, psychological, maybe even religious overtones and connotations, but the majority of what's going on in modern yoga has to do with the body, right? When you go to a yoga class, yes, we might say a couple Sanskrit verses, yes, we might spend 3 minutes meditating, but well over 90% of the time is going to be spent on the body, and then they can kind of like interpret things as like a metaphor, you know, what you do on the mat, you do in your life, and that sort of thing, but really there's no way around the fact that the modern yoga movement is primarily based on the body. So this just becomes another permutation of how the word yoga gets used. And it's, you know, and it never had a singular usage in India anyway, you know. So what I'm talking about is a very specific use of the term yoga. And this is what can often be called classical yoga. This is referring to yoga as a philosophical school, right? And as such, it's one of the 6 darshanas, you know, what we might call Astika philosophies, Nyaya Vaisheshika, Vedanta Mimamsa, and then Yoga Sankhya, all right? So this lecture is going to go right in between Tom and Tom, right? So this is going to pick up where your Sankhya left off, and it's going to also kind of linking to the arguments where the yoga school forcefully, or at least the Yoga Sutra, forcefully in the commentarial tradition, forcefully refutes pretty much everything Tom has been talking about all this time. So it's really cool. You know, every time Tom says something, you see me looking over at the sutra trying to figure out what the yoga guys have to say about this, all right? So it's very interesting in that regard. So this is the seminal work of yoga is a classical philosophical Indian school, what we might call a darshana, right, is the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. It's the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. And it's about 191 sutras divided into 4 chapters. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a synopsis of 3 of those chapters, which usually takes me about, let's see, I've been teaching it for about 6 or 7 years.
I was going to say 3 years.
Yeah, and I'm just finished the first chapter in 3 years. So I'm going to do 3 chapters in 45 minutes. So anyway, it's divided into 4 padas. The text starts with Atta Yoga Anushasana. Herein lies an exposition on the teaching of yoga. The term Anushasanam is one that's often used in tantric texts. Tantric texts are interesting because they tend to be condensed aphorisms. It kind of becomes a hallmark of this tantric style. And there certainly can be comparisons made with the Yoga Sutra and other tantric texts of the time, particularly in the term, in the way of starting it with this term Anushasanam, right, is also one that's employed in tantric texts, and also the brevity and the aphoristic style of the Yoga Sutra also makes it very similar. Tantras are said to be esoteric or secret teachings, so they're like small, so you can wad them up and hide them in your, you know, dreadlocks or whatever, you know. So that was just one of the features of tantric texts, and so in some ways this kind of sutra tradition has this kind of real short. And these sutras are designed to be unpacked, be that by a commentator or also by a guru within the tradition, okay? So the text starts with Atta Yoga Anushasana. Herein lies an exposition on yoga. And modern scholars come to understand this as meaning that Patanjali is not setting out to author a work of himself. You know, when we think about somebody who wrote that book, they came up with that idea. There's original thinking. But this term Anushasanam is taken to imply that really what Patanjali is doing is taking everything that people are saying about yoga at the time and trying to just like commit it. So this is one of the reasons why we see so many of these lists that are just in pan-Indic thoughts, things like the Brahma Viharas, the list of Viparyasas that I talked about last time, the Rupa Jhanas of the Buddhist system, you know, just the Ashtangas, they may or may not have been you know, composed by, they're actually believed to have not been composed by the yamas and the niyamas, ahimsa satya steya brahmacharya parigraha, all this stuff that we see in all of, everybody, all the religions have some version of these yamas, that become in the chapter. So what Patanjali is basically doing is he's taking all of these kind of lists and all this thought and all this stuff that people are saying, and he's systematizing it. And he's doing it based on the framework of Samkhya. Burley, for example, does a wonderful comparison of the Samkhya Karika of Ishwara Krishna, right? He's the one who wrote that, which is a Samkhya text, maybe the only pure Samkhya text that we have. And he compares that with the Yoga Sutra. And based on that, he comes up with some very interesting interpretations. And also, I think he fancies himself as a Kantian perspective on that, which is something that I really want to get Thomas and Bill Moria's input on. So anyway, the chapters are divided into 4, right? As I said, and then some scholars actually speculate that the 4th chapter is a later addition. And that's actually an idea I like. I don't really know. I don't need to know whether that's true or not. But when you read the text, it feels like it's true. Because there's like some sort of like similar use of language, kind of coherent structure to the first 3 chapters. And then all of a sudden the 4th chapter uses different terms for liberation. Several new words come up that are just not really used when they could be using words that were used in the other 3 chapters. So some kind of, it reads like somebody else. And then it just takes this whole philosophical turn towards the Buddhist stuff that we're looking at. What Bryant would refer to as Buddhist idealism, which is some of that Vijnanavada stuff that Thomas was talking about. So a lot of it is actually really just directly refuting the Vijnanavada. Okay, so that's the 4th chapter. I'm going to push that aside because that's going to be the point of interest in our next lecture if I get to give it, because that's where Bryant portrays the yoga school as a realist school, as opposed to, as we're going to find hopefully today, Burley, who sees it as idealist. So exactly what those terms mean in the philosophical context and how they're being used is what, part of why I need Thomas and Bill Moria. This is why I want to give this presentation, because it'll be very interesting to hear their feedback. So again, proceeding, we will look at the first 3 chapters. Now in 45 minutes. Oh, I have 45 minutes from now, okay? So the first chapter is called Samadhipada. Again, I'm going to leave out diacritics. That Samadhipada means chapter, okay? All right. The second chapter is Sadhana. Sadhana. Sadhanapada. We'll go with practice. We'll go with this maybe like meditation or something, right? With the caveat that any English words I use will always necessarily be that, because you just need to learn the words in Sanskrit. If you're really interested in this stuff, you really need to just go ahead and learn those 200 words of Sanskrit, but just for the sake of discussion. And then 3 becomes this Vibhuti-pada. This is like, I know somebody's going to get mad at this, but I'm going to go ahead and go with magic powers. Okay. And I kind of say that in a sense to be a little bit glib, but we'll get to that later. So now the interesting thing that happens here is that this is actually portrayed as being for like advanced practitioners, versus this is kind of referred to as Kriya Yoga. So keep in mind this term Kriya Yoga is as loaded as the term yoga is. And it gets used in all kinds of different ways. Notably, Yogananda, Paramahamsa Yogananda, used this to describe his sort of almost Hatha Yoga practice, which I take to be, I've never studied in the Yogananda tradition, but I take it to be in the tradition or similar to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika kind of stuff. But in this context, we're going to call that preliminary. That's how Taimni. Okay, so this is the preliminary, and this is advanced yoga. So obviously, you can see that there's something kind of curious going on. We start with advanced, and then we talk about preliminary yoga. It's a very, very interesting thing that's happening here. And we could speculate probably all day long why that happens. I kind of think like, let's tell you the really, 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 really awesome thing first, and then we'll tell you all the hard stuff you're going to have to do to get there. Right? It's like, we're not going to lead with the hard work, right? Let's tell you how rad it is. And then once you hear all this stuff, you're going to be like, yeah, yoga's awesome, meditation's awesome. And then you're going to get over here and you're going to be like, yeah, I guess I'll do all the hard work to get there. That's kind of how it feels to me. I mean, you can come up with your own theory, but however that is, that's how it works. We also have a similar distinction in the Bhagavad Gita that happens between Shama Yoga and Karma Yoga, right? Shama Yoga means like peacefulness and tranquility or something like that, which is, a corollary to Samadhi, right? And Karma Yoga kind of becomes like this preliminary practice, okay? So because this is preliminary, I'm going to go ahead and start over in Chapter 2, and then we're going to back up into Chapter 1 and look at some of the psychology of all of this as well, and some of the ontology, if we can call it that, because Burley rejects that there's any ontology to be had in this sutra at all, which is a completely radical assertion. This is why I really think that, if you're going to study yoga, classical yoga as a philosophy, you gotta know Burley's thesis. You don't have to agree with it, but because it's so radical and because it's so, I find it to be compelling. I find it to be compelling as a theologian, if not as a philosopher, in the sense is, Rita Gross, I was just reading her work this morning, was talking about the difference between a philosopher and a theologian. And she was making the distinction that a philosopher stands outside of the tradition and understands it, versus a theologian. I'm not really sure this is a good distinction, but a theologian sees themselves as within the religious tradition and interpreting and coming up maybe with new ideas. There's also a similar distinction that's happening here at the GTU with the new PhD program. Sacred texts in their interpretations as a plural. Apparently, when they were calling it that, the idea between interpretations is supposed to somehow imply that the PhD candidates there, see themselves as theologians who can come up with their own theological interpretations of the text and don't necessarily have to stick to it. But I'm not really sure that philosophers haven't been doing that as well too. So anyway, that's a question for Tom. But anyway, Kriya Yoga becomes the sadhana. Okay. And this becomes the meditation. The other word that I might put up here is nirodha. Okay? So actually, let me start in this chapter before I get to that chapter, and then we're going to come back here. This chapter, I already told you, Atha Yoga Nushasanam, that's the first sutra. Next sutra, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha, right? Yoga is the cessation. Of the churning of the mind. Okay, again, disclaimer, these are terrible definitions. You can't really do an English equivalent, right? But just to get this sort of idea here, right? What you can find is this is nirodha right here. Right? Nirodha, cessation. Okay, we've talked quite a bit about Bronkhorst's theory, and Bronkhorst does some lovely work comparing the Yoga Sutra with early Buddhism. And what we might note here is Nirodha. Both Tom and I gave a presentation on Bronkhorst's, what I said was threefold, what Tom said was twofold, interpretation of karma theory. One that, like, karma's bad, we need to not do it anymore. What do we do about it? Number one is we stop acting. We stop doing everything, and therefore there will be no fruition. And therefore we'll stop our karma. And this is when you start, you stop breathing, you stop eating, you stop walking, you circumscribe, and you just stay in one place. And if you're really good, you starve yourself to death, though that's very hard to do. I believe that the early pranayama practices were suicide practices. The breath control was to, you're suffering, you've been starving for 40 days, and you just want it to all be over. You got to be able to control your breath. It's even described in the sutra as the cessation of inhalation and exhalation, though then it starts becoming interpreted as like this kind of almost magic power that when you're really an advanced practitioner, you can just stop breathing and everything will be okay. It said that Yogananda would do that. He would go into these states where his heart would stop and he'd stop breathing, and the doctors would be frantic. Oh, he's going to die, and then suddenly he would revive himself. Don't know the credibility of that, but that's certainly what it starts getting interpreted as. Okay, so this nirodha so as you stop thinking, stop moving, stop acting, etc., you also are stopping your mind as well too, because with every mental action there's a reaction, and so therefore you create fruition with your own thoughts. So part of this practice of stopping karma is to stop your actual thoughts as well too. This gets adopted more or less by Jainism wholesale, obviously with some, but this is a pan-Indic thought according to Bronkhorst. He calls it mainstream meditation or immobility meditation, and it's a way of thinking that comes to affect all of the religious traditions. It's most strongly represented in the Jain traditions, but here we see it affect in the Hindu traditions. And just to continue our synopsis of Bronkhorst, the idea in the Hindu tradition is that if you understand that your soul is completely actually untouched by actions, and that you never were caught up in that stuff anyway, and it was just illusion and ignorance that made you think you were acting and caught up in karma. Once you realize that, it's like the spell is broken and you wake up, and then you're no longer subject to those actions, right? And that has to do with how you interpret your relationship to action. Karmani vadi kardaste ma paleshu kadachana ma karma palahi pur ma tesandasta karmani. Bhagavad Gita tells you, do not be attached to the fruit of your actions, right? But also don't be attached to inaction. Don't follow the immobility stuff. You still got to act. You still got to do your dharma, right? But also don't do it for the end result, because then you're throwing yourself in the cycle of karma. You don't have the adhikarta. You don't have a right to that sort of thing, right? You just act out of dharma unattached, and therefore you understand your soul is fundamentally unattached. And then na hanyate hanyamane shardibe, you're not killing and you don't die when the body dies, right? So this becomes the understanding, and that's the liberating gnosis. And then of course the Buddhists say there's no self at all. So this is very general, because there are so many versions of Buddhism as we've seen. But in a sense they kind of say, well, actually the idea that you were a self in the first place is an illusion. So these are all just different ways to solve the karmic dilemma. So this idea of nirvana, of cessation and stopping, it feeds itself back into the Buddhist Pali Canon. And the later passages of the Pali Canon, we start getting the Arupa jhanas, where it becomes one of the last states of that. So, and then it takes this strong root in the Hindu traditions, and this is one of the places that we see that. Okay, so yoga is the cessation of the mind. Then, once you've stilled your mind, you're established in your svarupa. Right? Your essential nature. Okay? Then you discover your essential nature, and we'll go over that in a second. Actually, I'm going to just reiterate Tom's model when we do that of Sankhya. You understand which is your soul, which is pure chitti, awareness. Pure, with no qualities, just the quality of consciousness. In other states, when your mind is churning, you're actually not in your essential nature. So I call this my sunflower model, because it looks like a sunflower, right? All right. Yoga, you are here. Worldly life, you are here. By the way, this is your mind, right? This is the essential purusha, your soul, that is without quality and is pure consciousness, right? This is where you go when you're doing yoga. You're headed in that way. When you're in normal daily existence, you're actually over here. So your point of orientation is here instead of here. So if we're going to take Burley's thesis, these things are happening simultaneously. He has a synchronic interpretation of this, as opposed to diachronic, which we're going to get to that later. But according to one way of looking at this stuff is all happening still, but you just reside in this perception. But then in the rest of this is the difference between pradanga chetana and pratya chetana, whether you were inward turned or externally directed. And if you turn yourself inward, sooner or later you're going to find yourself at home, okay? So that's the basic, what is yoga, what are you trying to do, okay? That's laid out in the first part of chapter 1, first couple sutras. And then we go on to vritti sarvipya mitarata, vrittya panchatya klishta klishta, pramanavi paryaya vikauta nidra smrtya. It goes into all of this stuff about it's like a categorization of what are the different types of way that your mind does this, that churns around, all right? I'm actually going to gloss over that and skip that, but just suffice it to say that your mind does all this, like your monkey mind, right? It's doing that, right? And then we go into, once we've decided what the churning is, then in chapter 1, he'll turn attention to defining Nirabodha, okay? But we're going to come back to that. First, we're going to go back to sadhana yoga. Now we're in chapter 2, all right? The practice of yoga, all right? So you're pretty awesome if you can do this, right? If you can stop your mind, you're already there. I mean, it takes years, lifetimes of practice before you can do the basic thing in the first 3 sutras, you know? You know, that takes forever. But you got to get there via this, okay? Chapter 2 starts off, Tapasvadhyaya Yeshwarada Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga, doing yoga, your preliminary yoga practice. For us lame guys who are not awesome enough to just sit down and stop our minds, which I can definitely include myself after years of Zen training, that's definitely me. I'm going to have to do something more like Tapas Svadhyaya Ishwarta Pranidhana. You got to start with asceticism. Then you have to do svadhyaya, study, which is why we're all in this classroom, right? Because we all intuitively know that this is just not going to happen. Otherwise, you'd be like, you know, just singing in the choir at your church, and, you know. But now we realize that, you know, the studying thing can actually help us in our spiritual journey. Maybe you realize that. I don't know if you're agnostic or atheist. And then the other one is surrender to the Lord. Caps that. Okay. And I'm capsing that is because much the same way we have Buddhist modernism, which is the very thing that we were talking about in the beginning of the class. You know, I resent the idea that Buddhism is considered non-theistic. You know, I resent the idea that people will not call Buddha a god. You know, because what it does is, in my opinion, is it's a post-enlightenment, post-enlightenment assumption that religion is superstitious and bad, and therefore, if we want to be spiritual, we have to find the one that's rational and good, and that's how Westerners went to Buddhism. They were looking for the rational good, and that's how it was portrayed. Again, with the Henry Steele Olcott Buddhist Catechism was a way of cleaning it up, sterilizing the Buddhist religion of these distasteful, superstitious things that contradict the post-enlightenment rationalism, right? And so now in modern times, we have a similar movement that's happening in yoga, whereas people are trying to secularize it, which they are. I mean, you know, I would say that most of modern yoga movement is very secular. There are spiritual overtones, but I think that either people, I'd say a large portion of modern yoga practitioners either don't care about those spiritual overtones or simply just don't know what to make of them. Like, why is it that my $200 pair of pants in a sweaty classroom with the heat turned up and me stretching, why is that spiritual? They're not really clear on what that can be. They kind of got a feel for it but nobody's like really clear on how that works, right? So what starts to happen is people, but they also want to present themselves as experts because, you know, there's the money, right? And if you're going to present yourself as expert, you got to be like, well, I know this old ancient esoteric tradition, and now a lot of yoga teachers are studying the Yoga Sutra, and they're interpreting it in a yoga modernism way. Oh, I just invented that term. All right, yoga modernism. That is to say, they're trying to sterilize it, right? So when they start talking about things like Kriya Yoga and Ishwarta Pranidhana, surrendering to God, what they say is things like letting go of your ego, you know, and it gets interpreted in that way in the modern yoga movement. But clearly the Lord is in the Yoga Sutra. That being said, I'm not going to go so far as Brian. Brian believes that the Lord plays a central role in the meditative praxis of yoga. My understanding and reading of the sutra is that actually the Lord is just one of many different meditative objects that are proposed in the Yoga Sutra. It may be a little bit better than some of the other ones because there's several sutras about it, but to me the goal of yoga, according to Patanjali, not even necessarily the commentarial tradition, is simply to realize your soul, no more. Right? And if thinking about God as a meditative object facilitates that because he's a Vishesha Purusha, he's a type of Purusha like us. And thinking about that helps us realize that within ourselves. That's as far as we go, right, with the Yoga Sutra. You're not accepting the grace of God in the Yoga Sutra by my reading. I think Brian and I are going to disagree a little bit on that. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. So this is what you do for Kriya Yoga, your preliminary yoga. Tapasvadi Yeshwara Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga. Samadhi Bhavanarthas Klesha Tanukardanarthas Cha. This is, you do all of these things to attenuate your kleshas, your mental defilements. You know, I could probably just do all this out of memory. Right? Okay, sorry, that's the other one. To attenuate your kleshas. Now in the chapter it goes into a basic klesha theory. There's a lot of lists of kleshas. Klesha means mental defilements, right? Can you dig a rhyme for me there?
Sure.
And flip it into the index chapter too, if you could. So, Tapasvati Yeshwara Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga, Samadhi Bhavanarthas Klesha Tanukardanarthas Cha. So we do these things to bring about samadhi and to attenuate your kleshas. Avidya smita raga dvesha vinivesha pancha klesha. Okay? Then we start going into the klesha theory. What are these mental defilements that we have? They are avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. Okay? These are the things that cause our problems in life. These are the reasons why we're stuck in samsara, so to speak, which has been the theme throughout all of this. Again, I really can't emphasize enough that what the Indian traditions have in common, I think outweighs what they have in terms of difference. Especially when you start looking at like what the people on the street are doing. You know, as opposed, I'm not sure that most Hindu Buddhist practitioners in ancient India could really articulate the philosophical distinctions between the yoga school, the Nyaya school, and the Buddhist school. So it ends up all kind of like being very similar. Like you saw the puja at the Jain temple, right? It doesn't look any different than what I would see in our Gaudiya Vaishnava temples. It looks very similar to what they're doing. They got their box of accoutrement, as my wife likes to say. One of the things they have in common is this acceptance that the karmic existence is bad and then what to do about it, right? Is where they differ. And that has to do with knowing what you really are, where they all agree on that. But then what that is all differs, What the problem is fundamentally avidya. What is this word, nascence? It's like the only time I've ever heard this word is when it's translating avidya. I mean, I've never seen it anywhere else. So, and then the other one is like ignorance. But then it's like, then you think like, oh yeah, if you're a racist bigot, you're ignorant. And so the problem is that y'all are a bunch of bigots, No, it doesn't mean like ignorance in that way. What it means is a fundamental misapprehension of the nature of yourself in relationship to reality. That's what it means, right? We saw that with Viparyasa from last week, right? Viparyasa is not that you're a little bit wrong. It's not that you kind of are off. You got some funky ideas. What Viparyasa means is that you could not be even more off the target. You are 100% wrong. The thing you think is Atman is Anatman. The thing that you think is Sukha is Dukkha. The thing you think is, etc., etc., etc. So you're completely wrong, right? Yeah.
I think nescience is actually pretty apropos. I don't know the etymology as well as you do, but of course, is a negator, right? In avidya. And vidya is related to vaid, which is knowledge. So ne in the nescience would be the negating factor, and science, like science, knowledge. So no knowledge or lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
So nescience could be, or misapprehension, something like that.
Yeah. I think those are all fine
Sorry
definitions.
to interrupt.
Oh no, they're all good. In my opinion, you could pick any English word that you want. I mean, you could call it purple elephant, but no matter what word you pick, you're going to have to give a paragraph explanation of why you picked that word, just as Thomas has, right? And you can come up with a good reason. Whatever. Again, I'm being glib. I tend to do that, but yeah, I think those are all fine words. I think ignorance is fine too. But whatever word it is that you're picking, you can't escape the fact that you're going to have to spend at least a paragraph defining the word anyway. Might as well use the Sanskrit word, because by the time you've done that, it's like now you get in this problem where you have to like translate the English word back into Sanskrit so you can understand what it means. If you would just go Sanskrit to what it means, it's one less step. It's simply a lot easier to learn the Sanskrit words than it is try to do this constantly. And then what happens is when people start talking, you find yourself going, wait, you're saying mind here. You're saying mind. What are we talking about? Buddhi, manas. Are we talking about Purusha? Like we saw here, it happened in how Shin and Chitta. Very different terms, but we could call them all mind. And I think this leads to some of the transformations that happen in East Asian Buddhism is because, you just can't tell the entire populace to learn new Sanskrit words, so they start using the Chinese words, they carry a connotation, they start to understand, affect how the philosophy is understood, So, nascence, avidya, right? Avidya, and again, this is, as Thomas pointed out, this is negative vidya. And the cool thing about Sanskrit is negation almost always implies a positive in Sanskrit. For example, ahimsa paramo dharma, non-violence, But Gandhi would tell you, non-violence is not passive resistance. He started calling it that in South Africa, but then very quickly he decided he didn't like that because there's nothing passive. It's a dynamic engagement. It's an active thing. So you start to find that with a lot of things, like apartigraha we've heard from the Jain temple, or all of these other negative terms. They actually imply like a positive, a presence of something. Right? From avidya is the kshetra. Avidya is the field from which all of these other things spring forth. Avidya kshetra mutara samprasutta tanu vichinodana. These all come from this. Your big problem is this. And from this ignorance you become, I hate the word ego. Especially since it means so, when you're, the way we use it colloquially and the way it meant to Freud, it's just it couldn't be more different. But anyway, I'm just going to use ego. But really, this is an interesting term. I'm going to get back to it. Raga, dvesha, vinivesha, panchaklesha, sukha nu sai raga. Sukha nu sai raga. It's an attachment to the thing that is sukha. I'm going to go with comfort here. Okay, the predilection towards comfort. That is raga, attachment. Dukkha nusayi dveshaha. Being averse to something that's dukkha. Now we're not talking dukkha in the Buddhist sense that everything's suffering and when you do a shoe suffering or something to that effect. We're talking about maybe discomfort. The way I take dukkha in this sense is like the dukkha that you get when you decide to do your homework instead of watch TV. You decide to eat broccoli instead of fudgesicles. When you decide to, I didn't mean to look at you when I said that. When you decide to exercise instead of sleep in, I actually slept in this morning, didn't do my 1,000 push-ups, only got 500. I think I threw a rib out because I was too tired. But that's the kind of aversion that we're talking about. Aversion to the uncomfortable thing that you probably ought to be doing, and attachment to the comfortable thing that is maybe not going to be in your best interest. And then abhinivesha is often taken to be clinging to life. Oh yes, Lord Vader, right? Anakin Skywalker, right? What happens to Anakin Skywalker? Why does he turn to the dark side? It's this one right here, right? He could not handle the idea that Padme was going to die. And he was willing to do anything to stop that. Even sell his soul over to the dark side and Senator Palpatine. And that's what pushed him over. So, if you have any doubt about the power of being Vaishya, just think of Lord Vader. Okay? So that's clinging to life. Okay, this is a Klesha theory. So this is your Pancha Kleshas, your five elements of defilements. And again, once again, we practice this to get rid of this. Okay? Okay. So let's see. Then what starts to happen in this sutra? Let's see if I can back it up a little. This is an excellent book, by the way. If you guys are interested in this subject, this is really what you should read. Brian does just a fantastic job. And this is a really nice brief synopsis at 600 pages. What he does is incredibly ambitious in this. And that is he tries to give a synopsis of the major commentarial traditions and how they understand the sutra. And for him to be able to do that in a book this small is absolutely unbelievable. So I think he does a fantastic job with this, and I'm in great debt to him for this. So then the kleshas are destroyed, the mind dissolves, te pratiprasava heya shukshma, dissolves back into its original pratiprasava as kind of dissolution. We have that in Bhagavad Gita as well too. And then we start talking about the stock of karma has kleshas at its roots. So these are the very things that create your karma. And again, remember our problem is that we're stuck in the karmic world and we're trying to get out. Right? As long as the root is there, it will come to fructification. So then we have to think about stopping our samskaras and such. Okay? I think I'm going to move back to the... and then here's a very important one. 217. Okay? The terms that Tom introduced us to the Sankhya tradition is Prakriti and Purusha, right? Prakriti and Purusha means the spirit and matter. Ontologically taken, which again Burley does not, is that the fundamental, the universe can be divided into two things, spirit and matter. Yoga is a school of dualism. It's not non-dualism. I just scream this at the top of my lungs because the dominance of Advaita Vedanta in our culture, because of, Vivekananda, and bringing that stuff in, the Vedantic society, and a lot of this stuff is so strong and dominant in our culture, it's very hard. You ask your average yoga instructor, what does yoga mean? It means union. What does union mean? Oh, you become one with everything. It's like, well, no, actually it means two with everything, right? I actually thought of an interesting translation for yoga that didn't imply that same sort of... So the problem is it means union, and people take that to mean oneness, right? And really what your gnosis in yoga is actually to understand... So the problem with the vidya is like somebody's taken the jar of salad dressing and shaken it up. The Prakriti and the Purusha Prakriti is always untouched. But the problem is that these are very, very problematic metaphors, and I'll give you the problems of it. But one of the metaphors that they use, one that I don't like, but for the sake of conversation, is that the Purusha, the spirit, is like a sun of consciousness that's beaming into the Prakriti. In the same way the sun can create life and plants and everything that we have here without being touched, that's how Purusha works. It's passive. It's just doing its own thing. But at the same time, it has a way of activating Prakriti in what we might call a passive way. So when we're down here, we don't realize it's all coming from the sun. We think that there's a plant, there's an animal, there's this and that. We don't realize that the sun is one thing and the earth is another thing. This is real clunky metaphors. But in yoga, that's what you're trying to realize. Is you're trying to take the Prakriti and the Purusha that appears to be mixed up, and you can't tell the difference. Our vidyas that we're walking around, stumbling around in life, and we can't tell the difference between spirit and matter, which is what one of the criticisms that we might have against our Vijnanavada Buddhists, is that the Buddhists think that somehow the material of the chitta comes together and from that produces a sense of luminosity, and they don't realize that that luminosity has an external source, right? So that's what's going on with the avidya here in the chitta. So yoga is a school of dualism in that you're trying to realize the distinction between spirit and matter, right? That they are separate, and trying not to confuse the one for the other, right? And again, that's a form of viparyasa. So the way the Yoga Sutra tends to talk about this is drashta, and drshya. Drashta means, drashtur is the seer, the agent. Tur is an agentive ending. We call it trich pratyaya in Sanskrit. Drashtur, the guy who sees, right? Drshya is the thing is seen, right? And so here in chapter 2, we have a very nice, clean definition of what you're trying to do here. Drashtur drshayos and yoga heya hetuhu. The conjunction, the sanyoga, the coming together, the conjunction of the seer and the seen, is the very thing that you're trying to avoid, right? And that's your definition there. Okay. So what else is happening here? And then it goes on to the cause of that conjunction is avidya, tasya hetur avidya, right? You confuse the one for the other. You can't tell the difference. And when we're talking conjunction, we're thinking like intermixing or something like that, or something to that effect. Not like two things, but they get so mixed up that you can't tell the one from the other. Is kind of the feeling of the sanyoga, right? And then removing ignorance, that's, and that's caused by ignorance. Once the ignorance is gone, the Buddha had that wonderful syllogism where he says, remove the cause and the effect no longer happens, or something to that effect, And this becomes a very standard trope in all of these texts, really. So removing ignorance, and you're no longer going to have that problem, right? And you do this through viveka and kyati, right? Viveka and kyati, okay? This is like discrimination and discernment, okay? I'm going to get to that here in some of the... This is going to be really funny. And then what happens at that point is, as if the Kriya Yoga is not enough, then we're going to propose Ashtanga Yoga. It's like this tip is retracting. It's trying to hide from me. Okay, Ashtanga
Try the
Yoga.
other one.
Is there another one?
Yeah.
Let's do that. So Ashtanga Yoga becomes 8. All right, so here we have 3. Here we have 8. Ashtangas, 8 limbs, 8 ways of doing this, right? I don't want to go into all that. All right, so Yama Niyama Asana Pranayama Pratyahara Dharana Dhyana Samadhi Ustavangani, right? These are Yamas, Niyamas, Asana Pranayama Pratyahara Dharana Dhyana and Samadhi, right? The first 2, Yama Niyama, are kind of these moral precepts, some of the stuff that we're hearing about in the Jain temple. Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, Parigraha, Yama, Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Aparigraha, Brahmacharya. Just leaving it at that. The niyamas become Saucha, Santosa, Tapasvadya, Yeshvara, Paridhanani, Kriya Yoga. No, that's mixing them up. But it's these 3 plus a couple other things like purity and contentment, okay? And then at that point, Yama Niyama Asana. Okay, so this is a big mix-up, right? With modern yoga practice, everybody's like, oh, look, there's asana, because that's what you do, right? You touch your toes, it's called asana. You stand on one leg, it's called asana. One arm handstand, that's called asana. Not what's going on here at all right? Asana here means you sit down. Do this while you're sitting, that's all. Sukha nusai, sthira sukha asana, right? Asana is when you sit comfortably. It's also when you have a samapati, like a concentration, and a saitalya of prayatna. You release your effort. You sit and you relax. That's all. That's all. It's not so much later that we have various different asanas, which it makes sense if you're sitting in one. I mean, if you've done Zen meditation, you know how painful that stuff could be. It makes sense that if you've been sitting like this for 2 hours, it's going to feel really good to take this leg and turn it back. Or to suddenly do this one and this one. And then maybe it's well, maybe I want to lie down. It's if you sit around meditating enough, sooner or later you realize that there's different ways you can sit down that's going to help you. And that's maybe where some of this asana stuff came from. But anyway, so ahimsa, yama niyama asana, pranayama, breath control, pratyahara, withdrawing the senses, kind of like I'm saying here, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. Okay, dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, samadhi, high meditation. I used to teach this stuff to little kids, right? And I would ask these kids, what are the ashtangas? And they would name them right. And I'd say, what do they mean? And so it's really cool because if you get an 8-year-old to tell you what samadhi means, it's if you can actually convey that in 8-year-old terms, you've got a good understanding of it. And they were meditation, high meditation. Right? These terms all get kind of used in the Yoga Sutras. It's clear hierarchy, samadhi is higher than dhyana, I guess. But really, in the Pali Canon, it's not necessarily so. Samadhi can be like anything, in the Pali Canon. It gets used really loosely, as opposed to here, what we're going to see is a very well-articulated structure. Yeah.
Is there any element of love or devotion in this?
No. What you're realizing is pure consciousness, right? And this is where the Bhakti traditions pick up. Sri Chaitanya, the revivalist of, about 1433, I think he was born, of the Chaitanya movement becomes prominent. He starts the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, as I mentioned, I'm involved with. What he starts his 8 verses with, it says, Chetto Darpana Marjanam, cleansing the mirror of your mind. We also call that Shanta Rasa, realizing the peace. Right? And then the Bhakti tradition kind of says, okay, that's cool, now what? Let's fall in love. Let's stimulate, let's agitate. let's get, I'm reading some text on Rupa Goswami right now, and it's like every emotion you can ever feel, whether it's like anger and hatred and depression, all of that can be considered interpretations of your devotional love to God. It's really interesting. Srila Prabhupada goes through and describes like hatred. Hatred means when you like can't stand somebody, and then he goes and tells like a story of, at one point like the gopis were jealous of each other over the love and affection of Krishna, and they felt hatred to each other, and even that hatred is devotional love. It's just really interesting how it goes from this this clear, conscious cessation of experience, this luminous, pure, blank slate. I describe it as like if you're in student debt and you got 200 grand in debt, this is like the last day of your loan payment. You've paid it all off. You're like, and then you kind of go, now what? I need to make some money. And that's what Bhakti does. Bhakti says, cool, you got to zero, student debt is gone, now let's make you some money. Right? Actually, all of this stuff, Raganuga Bhakti, this very thing that was bad over here, that caused all your problems, is now the very path that we're following. Raganuga. Trishna, from our second noble truth. We want Trishna. Everything that you ever said was bad and everything is now good as long as you have it in relationship to the Lord, right? So that becomes a very different interpretation, but that's what happens in later Bhakti.
But there is surrender to Ishvara.
There is. Surrendering to the God, and again, this is why, it's hard to say. Bryant really does want to say that this means accepting grace. What Bryant says is something to the effect of, other meditation object will not help you. If you're staring at a flame, it's not going to help you. You can still get all the psychological processes of meditation that we're describing, but it's not going to be something that helps you back. However, Ishwara Pranidhana, that's the one meditation object that will help you back. And this sounds like grace. Right? God is going to reach out. You're reaching your hand out, God is going to reach down and help you out. So I can't read the sutra like that. It simply does not read like that to me. And I can propose different arguments for that as well too. So whether that means love, pranidhana is love, it's tough to say. I mean, I can't read anything that sounds like grace, and I can't read anything here that sounds like bhakti. Really what it looks like is shanta. It looks like just peacefulness, realizing your claim. And if you're living in a suffering life, if you're a parent and you have 25 kids and they're giving you a headache, what is this Facebook meme going around? I'm a mother and people ask me what I do for recreation. I spend time alone in the bathroom. I send my kids to school and then I'm alone. I mean, when you're in this really difficult life, just having nobody around and being nothing actually sounds really good. And so I guess if you're understanding samsara is this really difficult worldly thing you're going through, just nothing sounds really nice. But it's not complete nothing. It is pure consciousness, unlike maybe shunyata of that. Okay. So now we get back over here to chapter 1. Took me 3 years to explain. I'm going to get 5 minutes. All right. So this is what's going on with chapter 2. I think we can set chapter 2 aside. You get what's going on. It's like this preliminary practice, the stuff that you're going on. It's you're getting rid of your kleshas, right? To stop your karma. Right? The root of the karma is kleshas. You're realizing the separation of the drasthurla and the dirshya, the seer and the seeing, the prakriti and the purusha, some of Tom's stuff that we're talking about here. All right. So if we're going to take this ontologically, which again Burley doesn't, there's this dualism implied in here. Well, it's kind of interesting because you can see this dualism in the praxis as well, too. Like when Thomas was just telling us about how you're going from impurity to purity in Buddhism, and in a sense that kind of happens here. I mean, we definitely have the issue of purity, but this dualistic praxis is really, really, really important in here, okay? So when we start getting to what does nirodha mean, nirodha means, you tell me, what does nirodha mean? She hates when I call it. Abhyasa vairagya vyamtan nirodha. Abhyasa, she freezes up. She actually knows she could be a graduate student and stuff just from long car drives with me.
The video's on, so I can't. I always tell her,
Nirvana.
don't ask me.
Nirvana gets understood, and we're going to get into jhanas here. This is crazy. Nirvana is abhyasa vairagya vyamtan nirvana. Abhyasa. Vairagya. Okay. So Bhartrhari writes the Vairagya Shatika. Such a wonderful text. And he defines Vairagya in ascetic terms. Actually, the one that's come into my mind, and it's a little bit. See, these things, we have this Victorian culture that we're not even aware of, you know. Like if I start talking about sexuality and certain things, we all go, ooh, that's risque, you know. But like it's not really like that. Like the most sacred literature in Sanskrit will have all kinds of, you know, treatises on crazy sexual things, you know. Wendy Doniger cites a statement that they have, or like an idiom that they say at the Harvard Sanskrit school, and that is like every Sanskrit word has three meanings. It means itself, it means the opposite of itself, and it means something that has to do with sex. Oh, in the name of a god, right? And it's totally true, like you get that feeling. So like sexuality is self-focused. So Vairagya gets defined by Bhartrhari as like he talks about the kavyas, because in kavyas the poetry is all very romantic and very nice, and we describe women in this beautiful, erotic sort of way all the time. And Bhartrhari is a hardened ascetic, and he says something to the effect of, you know, he starts looking at women as, you know, like the thighs that the poets say are creamy white, and all I see is drenched urine. You know, and he says, and he goes over like, you know, he takes all this like these kavya tropes that describe the beauty of women, you know, the breasts are so good, and all I see is, you know, and he just does this whole thing, and that to him is Vairagya, right? It's like looking at the worldly desires and turning away from them and being like, it's like this very ascetic, like, like. You know, sensory grad, everything just looks gross to me. There's a wonderful story. I think it's not Bhagavatam. Where's the story? There's a story of a king who's roaming around in the forest, and whenever kings roam around in the forest in the literature, there's something bad going to happen. And he comes across this maiden, beautiful maiden, and he says, "I love you. Marry me." She says, "You love me?" He says, "Yes, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Please marry me." She says, "Okay, come back in 1 month." And so what she does is for that month, she saves all her bodily fluids, all her defecation, her vomit, her menstrual blood, her urine, her sweat, and I think she fasts too. And so she puts all this stuff in a jar, and when the king comes back and he's like, "Marry me," she's like, "Okay, this is me." Hands in the jar. It's like, "What is this? It's disgusting," you know. And this is the way of saying that, you know, oh, it's all just bodily, you know. And you'll hear statements like, "It's only the skin that looks good. Take off the skin, and then what? Is she beautiful?" You know. And these are this very hardcore, like renunciate, like, you know, they just have to deny sexuality in such forceful terms, you know. And so this is kind of how Vairagya can be understood. It's not understood in this way. In this way, it's Nirloda, right? Nirloda is abhyasa Vairagya, effort. And I want to go with non-attachment, or I mean, let's go with release. Again, these are really bad translations. But nirvoda, cessation, that's the thing that we define yoga by. How do we do this? Abhyasa Vairagya nirvada. Tatrastito yanobhyasa. Sattu dirgha kala nirvanteya sakarasvita vedabhumi. Durstanushavika visayampitursnasya basikarta samya vairagya. Right? Okay, so there's a few sutras that define vairagya. We're not going to go into that. Abhyasa. So they define them. But for all intents and purposes, let's just leave it like this, okay? Now I'm going to keep throwing this dualism around, okay? So one of the other things that happens, and I don't mean dualism in a philosophical way, I mean like just like these kind of binary opposites that are inherent in the text, right? And that have to do with your meditative praxis, right? Ekakarata. Nirvoda. Okay. We have, this is called Parinamavada, right? Parinamavada is often equated with Satkardhyavada. Satkardhyavada is often translated as the effect pre-exists in the cause. And there's no separation between cause and effect. Burley hates that. Again, I don't know when I'm going to ever get to Burley. But part of the Anamavada is the transformation that your mind undergoes, okay? Let's go ahead and, I'm going to jump ahead into how we can understand the mind in the Yoga Sutra, right? The mind is like, it's a material substance, it's part of Prakriti, it's impelled by Pradusha, the spirit, like the sun is, or like a movie projector, right? Shines through the film and creates this fictitious world, but the movie projector is untouched, right? It does all that. But the mind part of it, not the soul part of it, the mind part of it is matter, it's Prakriti. And the way I like to think about this best is like pixels on your computer screen, okay? Pardinamaikatvat vastu tattvam. What is the shukshma around? Ekatva. They talk about your mind as being this transformation of a singular entity, right? And like when you're watching TV or whatever it is that you're watching on your television with the pixels, it's going to create infinite pictures, but it's really made of this one thing, whatever that is. All right. So anyway, the praxis kind of fluctuates between these extremes, whereby it creates this kind of a third state of mind, which is Unirota. Okay. Anyway, I'll try to pick up some of that where I left off next time. We'll see how far we get with this. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, that was great.